Hey everyone, today I'm going to be showing you how I created this wire wrapped pendant design. I feel like even beginners can follow along with this tutorial, as I will be taking you through all of the foundational principles and techniques that I use for all of my jewellery designs. I only use two types of pliers for most of my work, and these include wire snips and bent nose pliers. I recommend using high quality tools, as this makes the process of crafting with wire a lot easier, and it's definitely worth investing in good quality tools to make the job easier. Having high quality snips is important because it makes cutting the wire cleaner and sharper and leaves you with a nice clean cut. I use these bent nose pliers that are pretty high quality. They're very firm, strong material. I think they're made of titanium, and I use these pliers for pretty much everything as they're extremely versatile. Today I'll be wrapping this piece of green onyx. This stone is a bit smaller than a lot of the stones that I use. However, this tutorial can also be used for a larger shaped stone, and you'll just need to increase the sizes of the wire that you're using. For the outside frame of this design, I'll be using 0.5mm weaving wire or 25 gauge wire. I typically like to use weaving wire that is about half the diameter of the base wire that I'm weaving together. I'll also be using 0.4mm wire for the inside frame, also known as 26 gauge wire. As you can see, I haven't got very much left of this 0.4mm wire, so let's hope that I can make up for the rest of the design using the 0.5mm wire that I have. To begin, I take my 1mm base wire and I start by anchoring on the 0.4mm weaving wire. I hold it in place with my thumb and forefinger on my left hand and start weaving singular wraps or coils around it. Each wrap and coil creates a sort of anchor point so that this wire stays on the base wire. I then push them together with my fingernail to bunch them all together and keep it nice and tight to the base wire. I'll make between 5 and 10 coils around the base wire until I feel that it is nice and anchored on to the base wire and isn't going anywhere. I'll zoom in here so that you guys can have a better look at it. I'll then move this anchor point to about a third of the way along the base wire, as I'll be weaving the middle third of the wire to create the frame for the stone. I then add on the second piece of 1mm base wire and coil the weaving wire around both pieces, like so. Make sure to pull it nice and tight, but not too tight so that it doesn't deform or create a bend in the base wire. To then add the third piece of wire on, I weave this base wire through the middle of these two pieces so that it's nice and anchored on to these two pieces of base wire. I'm now adding the third piece of base wire to the top of the base wires. Make sure to keep them nice and flat and parallel to each other so you can create a nice neat weave. I then weave the weaving wire over the top of this new base wire and push all of the wires in tight together so that it's not messy and the pattern is nice and neat. I then bring this weaving wire out from under the bottom and then between the top and middle base wires, again using my thumbnail to pull the weaving wire nice and tight and push all the wires along so that they're nice and tight together. Once I've wrapped the 3 base wires like this, I then do more coils around the bottom wire. I'm choosing to do 4 coils here. This pattern is up to you and depends on the design that you would like to create, and it's very versatile, so you can have fun playing around with different numbers of coils and different patterns. I then begin the pattern again by coiling the weaving wire over the bottom and middle base wires, and then once again bringing that weaving wire up between the middle and bottom wire and over the top wire. And then I'm bringing it down over the bottom 2 wires again and between the middle and top wire. As you can see, the pattern is starting to form, so hopefully you have a good idea of the pattern that we're going for here. This is maybe one of the simplest and easiest wire weaving patterns with just 3 base wires. I'll then continue this pattern along until I have created enough weave to create a frame for the stone that I'm using. This is how the weave should look if you've continued that on for a while. At this point, I don't think I've got quite enough to frame my stone, so I think I'll add a little bit more. I now feel that I've weaved a long enough weave to create the frame for the stone, so I'm going to start bending it so that the coiled part is on the outside. This again is up to you. You can have the coiled part on the inside, it just frames the stone in a slightly different way. I'm pinching the middle of the weave with my thumb and forefinger and bending it upwards to create a nice curve. You want to make sure with wire that you're not bending it back and forth too much, as this can cause the wire to go out of shape, so try to bend it as little as possible. I'm also now flaring the ends of the wires outwards, as this will make it easier to weave later on. When you have a section of weave like this, you can bend it back and forth a bit more, as the wire will be more forgiving since it's all weaved together. Here I'm basically just shaping and manipulating the wire until it comes to a small enough shape to frame the stone that I'm using. You have to make sure that the frame covers a little bit of the outside of the stone, as this is going to help the stone from falling out of the front of the pendant. After I feel that I've bent the frame to the right size and shape, I'll pinch the ends of the weave and bend these bits of wires outwards, as this is going to help angle the wires so that it's easier to weave them all together. I can now use my wire snips to just cut off that beginning bit of wire that I used as an anchor point for the initial coiling and weave that I did at the beginning of the frame weave. I'm now going to start pulling the ends of the wires up and straight out so that I can start weaving them together. To make this weaving process easier, it's good to keep the wires quite separated, so the wires on the outside are flared outwards and the ones in the middle are pointed up straight. With enough space between each wire, it'll make the process of weaving so much easier, as you'll be able to clearly see the end of each wire and therefore pull the weaving wire through each of them easily and clearly. So the weave that I'm going to do for this part of the pendant is very similar to the weave that we did for the frame. I've pulled the weaving wire over the bottom two base wires, and we'll continue like this up along the rest of the base wires. I'm then coming in between those bottom two wires and then over the two wires above them. I'm then taking the weaving wire and weaving up between the two base wires that I've just woven together. So I'm essentially going over the top of two base wires and then pulling up between, from behind, the middle of those two base wires, and so on and so forth. So again, weaving up over the top wire that I just weaved and then including the wire above it. And as you go, it's important to make sure you're keeping everything nice and tight. So pulling the weaving wire nice and tight, but again not too tight so that you don't bend and create dents in the base wire. Then I'm pulling it back through those two wires and up over the two wires above. I would usually speed up this part of the weaving process, but I'll keep it in real time so that you guys can really see what I'm doing, as this is quite a simple weave, but if you're new to weaving, this may be difficult to get your head around. Once I've gotten to the end of the row of base wires, I then come back down and continue the same pattern along back to the bottom of the base wires. This inner frame is then going to join an outside frame that we'll weave in a moment, so we can just leave it here as it is at the moment. Here I have two pieces of 1.6mm base wire. This I will be weaving together with 0.5mm weaving wire. You can also use 0.6mm weaving wire. Both of them work and create slightly different visual effects, and I'd recommend trying both and seeing what works best for you and what you find easiest. Here I'm beginning by simply creating a bend right in the center of this thick wire. Thick wires are fun to use because they are sturdy but malleable. I'm making sure that the bend is as even as possible. Once I've found the central point that I'd like to create a nice sharp bend with, I come in with my round nose pliers, as I find them very useful for creating nice sharp angles in the wire. Here I am sort of gripping the wire with the pliers and pulling them quite tight and pushing the end of the wire against the flat nose pliers to create a nice sharp 90-degree angle. I'll then do the same on the other side and keep going back and forth until I'm satisfied that I've created a nice sharp point. Since these base wires are going to be woven together, I'll do exactly the same process on the second piece of wire. Thicker wire like this is slightly less forgiving if you bend it the wrong way, so make sure that you really know where you want to bend it before you bend it, because these 90-degree sharp angled points are quite difficult to correct or get out if you get it wrong. I now compare the two base wires and make sure that they sit nicely together and have been bent at a similar angle. I've decided that I'd like one of these wires to come out at the bottom of the pendant at a kind of point to create a sort of nice elegant shape. So I'm making this point that I've already made in the wires a bit sharper using the round nose pliers, as it's much easier than trying to create this shape with my hands. Once I'm satisfied that this point is close enough together, I come in with my bent nose pliers and sort of squish the point together like this. You have to make sure you have a nice grip on the sides of the wires with the pliers, otherwise it's easy to slip around and deform the wire, but you're aiming for a shape a bit like this. I'll then open up the top of this point by gripping with the bent nose pliers and pulling the tops apart, as I want the angle to still fit the other base wire that I've created. You want to make sure that you're manipulating the wire fairly gently but firmly, and you can use the heat from your hands to soften the wire and straighten it out if it has bent slightly in places. I'm quite happy with how these two fit together now, so I'm going to start weaving them together. Just like the beginning of the previous weave, I'll start by anchoring the weaving wire onto the base wire by pinching it against the base wire and beginning to coil it around, one coil at a time, pulling it nice and tightly and firmly against the base wire. Since this base wire is thicker and therefore stronger, you can use a bit more tension and firmness without worrying about bending it, and you will also need to use more firmness to ensure that the weaving wire is nice and tightly anchored on to this 1.6mm base wire. I'll then pull this coil down to the bottom of the base wire and snip off the excess. Once I've lined up the second base wire to the first base wire, and again making sure that they're nice and flat together, I'm weaving over the weaving wire over both of the base wires and then coiling back over the original base wire that I've already coiled over. This is an even simpler weave than the first weave that we did, and the pattern that I'm going for is one weave over both of them and then about 5 coils over the inner base wire. Again, once you've done a section about this big, make sure that you're pulling it tight. I like to use my nails because they're quite strong. You can also use pliers or another kind of tool to pull together the wires and keep them tight together. So once again, I've coiled the weaving wire over the top of both the base wires, then back out under the bottom, and I'm coiling 5 times around the bottom base wire. I've spread this up here a little bit as I feel like this weave is quite easy and self-explanatory. If you're still struggling with it, go back and watch that section again until you're feeling more confident with it. As I go along with this outside weave, I compare to the frame that we made earlier and see if I've made enough. This is actually looking like more than enough, as this outside frame just needs to slightly more than encompass the inside frame. Once I'm happy with the length, I go ahead and do the same on the other side, again anchoring onto the inside wire, coiling 5-6 times, and then weaving the weaving wire over both base wires and continuing to coil along the inside wire about 5 times. Once I have woven both sides to the same length, I'll start bending the frame to my desired shape. This is my favourite part of the process, as the weaving can be quite tedious and repetitive and quite meditative. But I love this process of shaping the wire into the beautiful teardrop shapes that I love to make. And again, as we're shaping this outside frame, comparing to the inside frame, we want to make sure that there is enough space between the inside and outside frame, because later we're going to be coiling and wrapping the ends of these wires between the 2 frames. So if there isn't enough space, we're going to struggle with finishing the pendant, and if there's too much space, then we might struggle with keeping the stone in place. I'm pretty happy with the shape now, although I think I've woven too much of this weave either side, so I'm just going to go ahead and snip a little bit off. This is sometimes really easy, but here I was struggling to pull the weave off because I'd woven it too tight, so it may take some gentle force to encourage the snipped wires to come off of the end. And on this side, it was actually a lot easier and just slid right off. So I definitely don't have enough of this 0.4mm or 26 gauge base wire to weave the bail of this piece, so I'm going to snip it off here and complete the bail using 0.5mm base wire. Again, when we're doing a weave with many strands of wire, it's good to pull them apart so that there is clear space between each base wire. So I'm splaying the outside wires so that there's clear space between them and the inside wires. Once again, this is the same weave that we used earlier, weaving just 2 wires at a time. This is a really efficient weave that I use quite often and is super versatile. These outside wires, since they're 1.6 millimeter in diameter and a bit thicker than the inside wires, I'll actually weave over them twice to make sure that they're tight together. Again, if you're struggling with this weave, go back and watch the section before where we weaved the beginning of this with the inside frame. It can be a bit more challenging to weave multiple strands of wire, but once you get the hang of it, it's quite simple and just comes down to making sure that the weaving wires are tight together and that all the base wires are nice and flat and parallel to each other. Once we've weaved the first row or two, we can start pinching together the outside wires, as although we want to keep them splayed for making the weave easier, we don't want to keep them splayed out the whole time, as we want to make sure that the weave is nice and tight and it all follows a nice straight line. So here you can see that the bottom of these wires that are close to the weave are nice and straight and parallel to each other, but the ends are still splayed out, which makes it easier to distinguish between them and continue the weave without getting confused between the base wires. I don't have an exact measurement for how long the bail should be. I usually just eyeball it, but this looks about long enough for us to bend it over and create our bail. So now I'll come in with my snips and snip off the beginning of this weave. Make sure that you snip quite close to the base so that there isn't a scratchy bit of wire poking out. You can get tools that help you bend the bail nice and cleanly. I just use my pliers because I like to use a minimal number of tools. It makes things simple and easy, but if you're struggling with using your pliers to make the bail, you can get a bail making tool. I'd actually forgotten before I started bending this weave, but I usually anchor off the weave the same way that I anchored onto it, by making a few coils around a single wire. So I pull this super tight to make sure that the weave doesn't move around too much whilst I'm bending the bail. Then you can go ahead and snip this off, ideally snipping on the side that is facing inwards, just in case there's any scratchy bits of metal. It's always best to keep them facing inwards so that they don't scratch anyone or irritate the skin. We want these wires to be as flat as possible to the back of the pendant, as these are going to help keep the stone in place. I'm using my left thumb here to create a point that I'm then pulling and bending the ends of the wires so that the bail still keeps its nice round shape, but the ends of the wires are fairly flat and parallel to the back of the pendant. I can now see that a few of my wires aren't the same length on either side, as you can see, these two central wires are different lengths, so I'm going to go in with my snips and snip them so that they're the same length. Again, I'm splaying the wires out here so it's nice and clear which wire is which. When it gets to this stage, I sometimes accidentally use the wrong wire, so it's good to make sure that each wire is clear. So we want everything to be symmetrical, and I can see that the 3rd and 4th wire are a lot shorter than the 7th and 8th wire, so I'm snipping those to make sure they're the same length, and as you can see now, it's all looking a lot more symmetrical. The first wires that I begin to work with here are almost always the 2 central wires, as this is going to be the wires that keep the stone in place the most down the central column. So I'm bending them over the bottom middle section and back through that middle gap between the 2 frames. And the bent nose pliers are really useful here because they're really strong, and because they're pointier and thinner at the end, you can really use them to get into tighter spaces in the wrap. So we want to make sure this wire is nice and secure to the frame, so I'm using my snips to pull it nice and tight. Again, not too tight so that it deforms the frame in any way, but tight enough that you know it's not going anywhere. And I'm going to go in and do the same on the other central wire. This whole design is very symmetrical, so whatever we do on one side, we want to make sure we repeat it identically on the other side. Now that we have those 2 central wires secured, I'm going to see if we can keep our stone in place. So I'm just going to slide it in through the middle of the frame, and it seems to fit pretty well. At this point you can see if there is too much or not enough space between those back wires and the frame, and adjust accordingly, but here it seems to be the perfect amount of space. For the 2 central wires on the outside of the central wires that we just wove in, I'm going to be doing something pretty similar and just weaving them around the back and then over through the middle of this outside frame. And once I've done the same on the other side, just going back over those wires that we've secured already and pulling them nice and tight again, just to make sure they are nice and secured. Now I'm just going to take these thicker outside wires and splay them outwards a bit so that there's more room to work with, and take these 1.0mm inside wires, and these ones I'm actually going to bend inwards through that central frame so that it creates a bit more tension between the stone and the frame, as this will help to hold the stone in place a bit better. Once I'm happy with how the stone is sitting, I'm pinching together just below the bail on either side to again create more pressure in the frame to ensure that the stone is nice and snug and held in place. I'm going in with my bent nose pliers and creating little bends in these wires at the back, as this is very pretty and adds a little bit more detail and intricacy to the design, as well as adding tension to the wires so as to make sure they're holding the stone nice and tightly in place, and to make sure that they're not loose at all in being attached to the rest of the frame. I've tightened up these ends a little bit more, and I think I'm gonna bend this wire in between those two frames one more time to add a bit more detail to the design and also create a bit more security in the wire, as sometimes if you snip the wire without them being secure enough to the frame, they can become a little bit loose, and it felt like these wires needed a little bit more security. I'm now pretty happy with how secure all of these wires are, and I'm going to start snipping them off, making sure to snip them as close as possible to the frame. If they are still a bit rough after you snip them, you can come in with a metal file later on, but it's good to make sure to snip them nice and close to the base so that there isn't any scratchiness. Now we can decide what to do with these remaining outside wires. Now that the stone is nice and firmly held in place, we can use these wires purely as decorative aspects of the design. So I'm curling this around the front and using my finger to create a soft bend, and doing the same on the other side, of course. There's no way to really teach this. I feel like this kind of wire manipulation comes with practice and getting used to how the wire feels and knowing how to shape it with your fingers. I prefer using my fingers more than other tools because I love the tactile feeling of the wire and feeling how it's bending. Now I'm going to bend the ends of these wires back under and towards the back of the pendant, and so I'm going to hold this front bend in place with one hand whilst I do this so that it's nice and tight to the rest of the design. These ends are definitely a bit too long, so I am just going to snip them here, as all I'm going to do in a moment is curl them underneath the outside frame, and I don't need very much of the wire to do that, so I've snipped off about 1 inch or so there. Then I'm going to come in with the round nose pliers and simply bend them firmly inwards so that the ends of the wires are pointing inwards, but not so far that they're pointing out the other side of the pendant. We want to make sure that nothing can touch the ends of these wires so that they're not scratchy. Now I feel like doing pretty much the same with this remaining outside wire. So the same process as before, but now we have the pathway of the other wires to follow. So simply bending them along the same path, the same flow as those other 2 wires that we've just bent. And we're doing pretty much exactly the same thing here, so holding the front curve of that wire down quite firmly whilst we bend it behind the back of the pendant so that it isn't too loose and it's held nice and firmly against the rest of the design. And as you can see on the back, they are a bit too long, just like the other wires that we've just bent, so I'm going to snip them here so that I can bend the ends nice and neatly in between the frame. Okay, and this is the finished design. At this point you can use a protective coating if you'd like to keep it nice and shiny in this nice shiny copper colour. Alternatively, I often oxidize my pieces to create a nice ancient antique looking effect, but everyone has different preferences to how they like to finish their copper. I also recommend using some metal filing tools to file down any sharp edges that you may have poking out from the ends of the wires. Sometimes you don't have any and you can finish the design right here. If you liked this tutorial and found it helpful, please leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear your guys' feedback. You can keep up with my work over on Instagram at elven_adornments. There I share absolutely all the work I create, as well as the behind the scenes of the collections and projects that I'm working on. I'm currently creating my second ever all silver collection, and it's one of my favorite collections I think I've ever made, so I'm super excited to share that with you guys, and thank you so much again for tuning in.